The distinction between competence and non-competence has been defined and safeguarded by international practice. But is this a meaningless definition in this day and age? How do national populations defend themselves, and should they? After all, aren't we all competent? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Civil defense, once considered a relic of history or a target of ridicule following the end of the Cold War, has seen a resurgence in relevance in the 2020s. In an era marked by terrorism, global pandemics, rising political tensions between nuclear-armed states, and a deepening climate crisis, emergency preparedness is once again a priority on the political agenda in many countries. Civil defense, a system used to protect civilians from coming under attack, involves plans for preparing for and responding to emergency situations, plans for evacuation, and plans for how to recover from attacks. The concept of civil defense has been discussed at least as early as 1920s and was implemented in some countries during the 1930s as the threat of war and aerial bombardment grew. The focus of civil defense has largely shifted from responding to military attacks to dealing with emergencies and disasters in general. Some countries treat civil defense as a key part of defense in general. In Europe, new initiatives are being introduced by the European Commission in its multi-billion-euro research program, Horizon Europe. A part of this program prioritizes research into civil security for society. The Commission aims to improve situational awareness, data-driven decision-making, and understanding of the risk exposures among authorities. It also seeks ways to cultivate a culture of disaster preparedness for citizens, communities, public administrations, businesses, companies, and practitioners.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Professor Jarosław Gryz, the Faculty for National Security at the War Studies University here in Warsaw. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
First of all, before we start exploring the topic of civil defence, what exactly does it consist of as opposed to military defence, for example?
That, in that regard, follows how the civilians should behave in the context of the conflict, how they should be protected, how they act in that situation, and how they will follow a certain, let's say, rules which will allow them to, at least, to be safe.
Such as what? What are the rules, generally speaking?
Generally, how to adapt to the, let's say, crisis or the conflict situation, how to behave in that context, giving help in the certain situations, how to be organized, how to follow, let's say, certain orders they will be given, and how to protect themselves in the different situations, at the same time giving the help to each other.
We assume, therefore, that the country will be under a martial law or a war footing?
Yes, indeed.
What's been the historical, what's been the history of civil defence? Let's start with here in Poland. Is it a sophisticated system? When did it start, and how was it developed or neglected?
Well, the roots of the civil defense comes out from the very beginning when we established the independent state in the 20s of the 20th century. And the civil defense was something what was developed since after in the 30s, and the elements of the civil defense we could easily, let's say, recognize during the campaign 1939. Because the civil defense then, for instance, in Warsaw was really doing a great job. So that was the roots. And during the period of communist time, it was adopted to the certain rule under the communist, let's say, governance, but was done really good in terms of protection of civilians.
In terms of what? Bunkers under blocks of flats, that kind of thing, or the mobilization, the disciplining of a population to react to crises?
Well, the whole system was at the time, in fact, the war system. If we commemorate something what was named 1,000 schools for 1,000 years of the Polish statehood, the schools were designated as hospitals. And they all the same repeated the same architectural structure.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, everything what was done was correlated with the wartime and the certain solutions in that respect.
Have these plans been just dusted off and implemented? How do you gauge the status of Polish civil defense today?
They were valid till 1989, 1990. Then after, when we had the, let's say, transition from the communist to the democratic system, all those elements, even in context of the, let's say, period of time, were being apart, in fact. And not much, let's say, well done in this context of preserving the certain, let's say, solutions and preserving the certain obligations by the state. It was quite costly, so that is maybe in that regard why it happened.
It's something that states tend not to spend money on, the civil defence. They spend money on the armed forces, of course, to varying degrees of efficiency, but the civil defence tends to be a neglected form, even though in the Polish context we read in the Polish constitution that it's our obligation as citizens to defend. How do we reconcile that?
Well, in fact, it's true, but let's have in mind that the civilians should be adopted to the certain system of functioning during the let's say, period of the wartime and the period of the crisis. And in that regard, we don't have such solutions which are now being adopted and which, let's say, reflect the whole systematic approach, what should be done in terms of the Poland and what should be done in terms of the different provinces, because in that regard, they are different one. So from that perspective, we have to overcome the situation, we have to overcome this gap, and what is needed in that regard is the rule adopted by our parliament, which will allow to create a system approach.
The idea historically of the nation in arms is, again, a fairly modern idea, is it? In the 19th century, you mobilize an army, you need to mobilize industry, so you need to mobilize workers.
Well,
is that too simplistic?
No, it is in fact the outcome of the French Revolution, when the citizenship became an, let's say, element, an instrument in the tools of the government and the state itself to implement, let's say, people into the military and non-military system. And from that time, this idea was developed.
Also, the reaction to that, wasn't it? The War of the Liberation in Germany, for example, the Napoleon retreating and the Germans, or at least that's the idea of the Germans, rising up to drive out the French, civilians being soldiers. Is that, and yet we have the rules of war or conventions of war that prevent armed forces flouting these rules not to harm civilians. How do we recognise that as a society? On the one hand, we're meant to be good citizens and protect our country, yet on the other hand, we're meant to be protected by international convention. Well,
many things happened during the last century and many things happened during this century. And in that regard, what was observed and what was described in one of the books, that nowadays we have the war among the societies. And the societies are as well treated as a military element, which have to be defeated. And throughout that, we have very different situations in comparison what started to be in the beginning of the 20th century, when really during the First World War, the armies followed certain rules of behavior. But during the Second World War, we could observe that the civilian targets were hit as well as the military one, and no one really took into consideration the consequences. And that element in context of the civil defense remained during the Cold War era and still is valid till now, even having in mind the outcome of the terrorist attacks.
Can you just elaborate on that? What's valid about this idea?
That we have the war among the societies, and we have to be prepared in that context for such a kind of, let's say, war. That the civilians are being targeted and being hit as well as the militaries.
We have different forms of language for war, don't we? In the Northern Irish concept, the history. When I was growing up in the UK, it was referred to as the Troubles. It wasn't referred to as a full-blown war. War was something that happened between two military armies, and yet this was a British army fighting a anti-terrorist organisation, a terrorist organisation among a population. The Korean War was labelled a police action. Does our language reflect the way we can fight war?
I think that yes.
You mentioned the war is everywhere, but
I am repeating
degrees?
the words of the Rupert Smith, that is a former NATO general who wrote a book about it, and during his observation during the service he observed what we have to deal with, that the civilians are being the target as well as the militaries. And in that context, I am referring to his outline. And I believe that still we can observe that situation if we take a look into the war Russia against the Ukraine, where the civilian targets are being hit into this constant element of this war.
At the beginning of the Second World War, there was this, Poland was involved in the in the invasion of between Russia, Soviet Russia, and Nazi Germany. Britain and France didn't intervene directly, but nonetheless, British bombers went over and dropped leaflets on Germany, warning Germans not to do this beastly act, to withdraw from Poland. British airmen were warned not to hit civilian targets or private property, and yet a few years later the RAF was carpet bombing entire German cities. This is how wars develop, don't they? That all the laws suddenly seem to be relegated. It's about victory.
Unfortunately, it is so. Well, if we recognize that still constant rules are valid, that the civil population should be protected, and that is let's say the main rule. That refers to then the rule of wars, what will be the target and what will be not target. So from that perspective, I believe that still, if we are having in mind what should we do and how we should act, that is relevant. Even though if we are taking a look at what happens in this Russian-Ukrainian war, and in the regard that the Russians lacking that element, it doesn't is let's say a valid outline for us.
Is it something that we can, as active citizens, escape from our obligations?
No, because we have the rights and we have the obligations. And all of us and all of, let's say, politicians in the main, let's say, course speaking about the rights, but very less about the obligations. If we are living in the democratic states and when we are living in the, let's say, liberal state, we should also fight for that, because that is our style of life. And if we, in that context, recognize that we are fighting for our style of life, that we do what we like to do, and no one else tell us what to do, that is an obligation. Otherwise, we could live in the autocratic or the or different other form of system. But if we refer to our liberty and we are referring to our freedoms, that is our obligation, and we should follow that. Otherwise, question is what we are doing here.
Yes, I mean, one of the, I suppose, the things that are often said about the start of the Second World War is that the French society was unwilling to fight for its freedoms and its democracy. Against when a liberal democracy comes up against a militarized democracy, it's the militarized sort of society always seems to win.
It's a very different situation and very complex attitude you just mentioned Why? Because we should have in mind what occurred during the First World War. And in the whole generation was nearly destroyed during the First World War. I do not have exactly in mind statistics for the French, but for the British. And we are looking from the cohorts from the end of the 19th century. And before the First World War, the number of the young people were 99.99. Then after the First World War, the number was 12%, 13, 15. And the same occurred in the France. So when the young soldiers went into the, let's say, in uniforms, their mother said, "Doesn't matter what you will do, you have to come back to me," because they never saw back the husbands, and they never saw the fathers of their sons. So that is different context comparing to the present one. We should have it in mind, but we should also have in mind what is the price, because that is something what we should, at least in our mind, balance and take out at least advantage. Who we are, what we are representing, and what we are striving for.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Gryz, for coming on to our programme. You mentioned the point about the rights and obligations, and to quote the American phrase, freedom isn't free.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that's all we have time for today. Do join me next time for How We Got Here.